Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a moment you're not feeling your best. Maybe it's just a persistent low energy, or perhaps something more serious has come up.
Hmm.
So where do you look for healing? You'll likely think of seeing a doctor, right? Maybe getting a prescription.
Sure, that's the first stop for many.
But perhaps you also reach for, I don't know, a trusted herbal tea, or start taking a supplement a friend raved about. Or maybe you've even considered something like acupuncture or seeing a chiropractor.
Yeah.
Where do all these different options come from, and how do they, fit together in the messy real world?
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just about deciding between like a pill or a tea leaf.
Mm.
We're diving into a really rich source, a
Ugh.
fantastic book that digs into the complex landscape of healing practices in our world today. It goes way beyond just conventional Western medicine.
Right.
It pulls together articles, research, historical accounts to show us the history, the power dynamics, the culture, even the economics that shape these choices people make.
Our mission in this deep dive, then, is to extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge, the insights, from this material. We want to understand what gets lumped under that umbrella term: complementary and alternative medicine, or CANM.
Which it turns out is a trickier category than it sounds.
Exactly. And we'll trace the fascinating story of how conventional medicine became, well, dominant, and how these other practices emerged, sometimes alongside it, sometimes really pushing back against it.
And critically, we'll explore how people like you, the patient, the user, actually navigate this sometimes confusing world. How do individuals piece together their own path to healing from all the options out there?
Yeah, precisely. We're going to look at the surprising facts and the often hidden dynamics this source reveals, not just about health and healing, but about how we decide what even counts as knowledge in this whole area.
Hmm.
This dive really shows us that healing isn't a single simple path. It's a complex, dynamic space shaped by history, culture, power, and even what the state decides is legitimate.
And the source pushes us, to think beyond simple either choices.
Yeah.
It encourages us to appreciate the vast, sometimes bewildering array of therapeutic possibilities people are actually using globally.
So let's start by getting our bearings. The source immediately tells us that the very language we use here is tricky. That term CAM itself.
Yeah.
Well, the source says there may be little that unifies CAM. It's a really broad category covering things used alongside conventional medicine, that's the complementary bit,
Right.
and things used instead of or even in opposition to it, that's the alternative.
And to describe this situation where you have multiple healing systems available in a society, the source introduces this key concept: therapeutic pluralism.
Ah, okay.
This term was coined by Charles Leslie to describe places like South Asia, where you have biomedicine, traditional systems like Ayurvedic medicine, various folk practices, all coexisting.
But the source prefers therapeutic pluralism over medical pluralism. Why is that distinction important?
Well, using medical tends to reinforce the idea that biomedicine is sort of the default, the standard.
Okay.
Therapeutic is broader. It reminds us that healing isn't just about what happens in a clinic or involves a medical professional. It includes things like spiritual healing or dietary changes, which people definitely use for therapeutic purposes.
That makes sense.
That's right. Though it's worth noting, the source points out that even the term pluralism itself can sometimes gloss over the significant power imbalances between these different systems.
Which is a huge part of the story.
Absolutely.
And that power imbalance is often linked to another crucial term from the source: status medicine.
Right. Status medicine.
This isn't just conventional biomedicine in isolation. It's biomedicine plus the entire state regulatory apparatus it's embedded in. Think laws, licensing bodies, regulations about what claims you can make, market approval, government subsidies.
Oh, full machinery. Exactly. Status medicine, according to the source, is a complex creation. It's shaped by professional groups wanting to protect their turf, exclude rivals. The states need to organize and control health services for its population, and significantly, the commercial interests of industries like, well, big pharma.
So right away, we see this isn't just about whether something works in a lab test.
No.
Healing is a dynamic, contested field heavily influenced by social structures, history, power, all playing out with the state kind of refereeing or maybe even playing on one team.
And understanding how we got here is crucial. These power dynamics and the very idea of alternatives have a long and fascinating history.
Let's dig into that history then. The source describes a world, say, centuries ago, before the 17th century in Europe, that looked quite different.
How so?
People had a lot more autonomy in choosing healers. You had wise women, herbalists, bone setters operating alongside university-trained practitioners. No single group really had a monopoly on healing.
Right, a much more diverse landscape.
Yeah. Control started to shift, not just through scientific discovery initially, but increasingly through legal means, royal decrees, licensing laws. The source mentions the Danish quackery law of 1794.
Allowing fines or imprisonment for unlicensed practitioners.
Exactly. But here's a surprising twist. These laws weren't always strictly enforced early on.
Why not?
Often simply because there weren't enough licensed doctors to go around. And skilled folk healers were still essential for many communities.
Ah, practicality.
Right. The source suggests enforcement often ramped up when these alternative healers started posing, well, a financial threat to the licensed practitioners.
Ah, the economic motive again.
And this drive for control took an even darker turn in colonial settler societies, where indigenous health practices were actively suppressed. This is a really powerful and, frankly, disturbing historical point from the source.
Yeah, it's crucial.
Look at New Zealand, the Tohunga Suppression Act of 1907. It specifically targeted traditional Maori healers, the Tohunga.
Right.
Practicing could lead to imprisonment. And this happened despite Maori often having really poor access to Western healthcare facilities.
But it wasn't really about providing better care.
Doesn't seem like it. The source points out it tragically contributed to the loss of indigenous knowledge, including vital practices around childbirth. And that act wasn't repealed until 1962.
62.
Yeah. Canada had similar suppressions. Ceremonial gatherings vital to indigenous culture, like the potlatch and the Sundance, were banned.
And they used public health as a justification sometimes, didn't they?
Yes, like citing fear of spreading tuberculosis, for example.
Okay, so while all this regulation and suppression is ramping up, what was the state of orthodox medicine itself in the West?
Well, the source describes the age of heroic medicine, popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Heroic medicine sounds dramatic.
The treatments were, let's just say, vigorous.
Uh-oh.
Bloodletting, massive doses of, frankly, dangerous drugs like calomel, that's a form of mercury.
Mercury, good grief.
Powerful purgatives, emetics. The source sums it up pretty starkly. Bloodletting, purging, and puking.
Yikes. What was the thinking behind that?
It was based on the theory of humors, the idea that illness was caused by, like, noxious stuff in the body that needed to be forcefully driven out.
I see. Expel the badness.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe counterintuitive. Why did patients accept, and in many cases demand, these often harsh, dangerous treatments?
Yeah, why would you?
The source explains it beautifully. These treatments produced visible, undeniable physiological effects.
So you could see something happening.
Precisely. If you're bleeding, vomiting, or purging, you feel and see something dramatic. It felt like the body was actively expelling the disease. Mercury was valued because of its powerful, obvious effects.
So the proof was in the purging, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. The idea was that drugs had to produce perceptible results witnessed by both the doctor and the patient.
So the very definition of effective was tied not just to getting better long-term, but to these intense, observable effects. It was a different kind of evidence back then.
Exactly. And this context helps us understand the battles faced by practices that emerged later, like homeopathy and chiropractic, as the orthodox system started to solidify its position and power.
Right. These new approaches must have seemed very different.
Let's take homeopathy first. The source tells us that in the 19th century, some medically trained doctors actually adopted homeopathy.
Really? Why?
They were often concerned about the dangers of heroic medicine, the bleeding and purging, and saw homeopathy as a gentler, potentially safer way to reform the field.
But the Orthodox Medical Association?
Yeah.
They weren't keen, I imagine.
Not at all. They actively pushed homeopaths out, made it unethical for their members to even associate with them. This exclusion basically forced homeopaths to form their own societies, their own institutions, which really solidified the divide.
Okay, setting up the alternative path.
And homeopathy gained popularity partly because it empowered patients, especially women in the home. Kits and books like Homeopathic Domestic Medicine allowed people to self-diagnose and treat common ailments.
Which, of course, was a direct economic threat to regular practitioners charging fees.
You got it. And homeopathy spread widely. Germany, France, the U.S., appealing across social classes, partly thanks to that accessibility.
Now, here's a crucial point the source highlights that really challenges the standard story we often hear.
Okay.
Homeopathy's popularity began to decline well before the discovery of truly effective biomedical treatments, like sulfonamides in the 1930s.
Oh, that is interesting. So it wasn't simply science wins.
Not exactly, or at least not again.
Yeah.
The source suggests other factors were at play. Broader cultural shifts favoring a different kind of scientific or technological authority.
Right.
The move towards hospital-based care, shorter consultations which didn't fit homeopathy's detailed case-taking, internal disagreements within homeopathy itself, and maybe most importantly, the fact that its highly individualized approach didn't really fit the emerging capitalist model of developing profitable, mass-produced universal remedies.
Fascinating. So economics and culture played a big role alongside the science or lack thereof at that point.
It seems so. Now, chiropractic faced its own intense struggle, maybe even more aggressive opposition.
How so?
Early on, chiropractors were frequently prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license.
Right. And the American Medical Association, the AMA, really doubled down, didn't they?
No, absolutely. They lobbied hard to stop patients getting insurance coverage for chiropractic care, and they had strict ethical rules forbidding their members from associating with or referring patients to chiropractors, so essentially trying to freeze them out.
Which eventually led to that big antitrust suit, Wilkes versus AMA, in the 80s.
That's the one, where the AMA was actually found guilty of restricting trade and conspiring to eliminate chiropractic as a profession.
Wow. And even after losing that and having to rescind the ethical ban, the sources, they continued their attacks.
They did. It was a long, bitter fight.
So how did chiropractic survive against that kind of organized opposition?
Well, the source points to a few key factors. Persistent popular demand from patients. People felt it helped them.
Okay, patient power.
Effective lobbying of state legislators. And eventually the state itself becoming more involved in organizing healthcare, which created a space, albeit often a contested one, for chiropractic to exist within the system.
The source details a really fascinating specific case that illustrates this struggle perfectly. The New Zealand Commission of Inquiry into Chiropractic in 1978.
Ah, yes, that was a real showdown, a rare public forum for these arguments.
You had the medical profession, physiotherapists, the Department of Health on one side.
And on the other, chiropractors, backed by thousands of patients, and even workers' groups who felt chiropractic helped with workplace injuries. The arguments were, well, starkly polarized.
What were the main points of contention?
The medical side questioned chiropractors' training, especially as primary contact practitioners who patients might see first. They criticized what they saw as overly broad claims, treating everything from pimples to polio was the phrase used.
Right.
And they raised public health concerns, partly over some chiropractors' known skepticism about vaccination at the time.
And the chiropractor's response?
They argue that medical doctors and physios weren't adequately trained in spinal manipulation, that their own training was designed for primary contact, and crucially, that they saved the state money, less reliance on pharmaceuticals, getting people back to work faster. Interesting how the economic argument comes up on both sides. Yes, and interestingly, the physiotherapists in the debate looked at how osteopathy had evolved in the U.S., seeing it as moving towards adopting orthodox medical principles. They sort of implied there was only one reality in science that all therapies must eventually conform to.
But the chiropractors resisted that, right? They didn't want to just be seen as technicians doing manipulation.
Exactly. They emphasized the more philosophical, or what they call esoteric, aspects of chiropractic, their diagnostic skills in detecting functional subluxations, their philosophy as an art and science.
Trying to carve out a distinct identity.
Precisely. They even used academic-sounding terms like a high indeterminate site technicality ratio, essentially arguing that their practice involves significant clinical judgment that can't be easily standardized or reduced to simple technical measurements. It was a way to create a protective barrier against being absorbed or controlled.
Wow, that NZ case really shows the struggle isn't just about clinical effectiveness, is it? It's about philosophy, professional boundaries, who gets to define the scope of practice.
Absolutely. And the outcome was complex. The commission actually criticized the medical profession's hostility, which was rare. But they didn't grant chiropractors the full status of a separate, independent healing art. They positioned them instead as complementary.
So under medicine's umbrella, essentially.
Pretty much. And they accepted the medical view that only an MD could really do a proper differential diagnosis to rule out serious underlying disease.
And what about the state's role after the commission?
Crucially, despite the commission recommending that chiropractors should have significant input into training medical doctors in spinal manipulation, the state denied them that power.
Ah.
This effectively drew chiropractic into a subordinate position within the healthcare system, relative to biomedicine. Controlled integration, you could say.
And we see this pattern elsewhere, like in sports medicine.
Yeah, the source mentions Thea Berge's study on chiropractors in Canadian sports medicine. It showed that to gain acceptance on sports teams, they often had to narrow their scope, focus just on musculoskeletal issues, and essentially work as team players under the direction of the team physician.
It really raises that question. How much does the struggle for legitimacy force these practices to kind of reshape themselves, maybe even compromise their original philosophy, just to fit into the dominant system?
It's a constant tension, and these dynamics play out very differently depending on the historical and cultural context. If we look beyond the West, say to China and India, we see fascinating and sometimes quite surprising forms of therapeutic pluralism in action.
Okay, let's explore that. What about Chinese medicine, or TCM?
Well, its story in China is deeply intertwined with the state, but in a really complex way. At times, historically, it was dismissed as feudal, backward.
Right.
But then under Mao Zedong, it was actively promoted, partly for national pride, but also pragmatically, to reduce reliance on expensive imported Western medicine.
So the state got behind it.
Yes, but it led to what the source calls orchestrated medical pluralism. The state wasn't just passively allowing different systems, it actively tried to standardize and, well, simplify TCM, making it fit better with scientific assumptions. For instance, having the Ministry of Health create standardized disease classifications that align somewhat with Western ones.
Interesting. And how does integration work in practice in China? Is it different from the West?
Often, yes. Physicians might genuinely combine biomedicine and TCM in their daily practice, maybe use a Western drug for rapid effect on something like high blood pressure,
Okay.
and then use TCM herbs to address what TCM diagnosis identifies as the underlying imbalance or constitutional weakness.
So using both frameworks.
Yes, and they even conceptually link Western anatomy and physiology to the functional body understood in Chinese medicine. Sometimes using Western diagnostic tests, not just for Western diagnosis, but to explore or confirm ideas from ancient TCM texts, potentially opening up new approaches.
That sounds quite sophisticated. How does that compare to TCM in the West?
It's often quite different. In the West, TCM has often been only partially incorporated and sometimes marginalized or misunderstood. The source gives an example of a Canadian clinic where biomedical practitioners treated acupuncture with a kind of chicken soup analogy.
Yeah.
Nice, maybe comforting, but not clinically significant in their view.
Right, sort of dismissing it.
Yeah, they didn't really grasp TCM diagnosis and tended to explain any effects purely in biomedical terms, like endorphin release.
And regulation in the West creates its own issues.
Oh, definitely. Paradoxes abound. In Victoria, Australia, for instance, licensing means only registered TCM practitioners can legally perform acupuncture. So others using similar needling techniques might call it dry needling to avoid the legal definition.
Ah, the power of terminology.
Exactly. Or think about herbs. Regulations aimed at safety meant certain toxic Chinese herbs, which expert herbalists traditionally knew how to use safely in very specific contexts and dosages, became inaccessible to them. But potentially, those same herbs might still be available to less trained medical doctors using them outside that traditional safety framework.
That seems counterproductive.
It can be. And medical acupuncturists in the West, doctors who also practice acupuncture, often had to present a very de-radicalized, scientific-sounding image to gain acceptance. They'd emphasize correlations between acupuncture points and modern physiology.
Playing the science game.
Right.
Yeah.
But the source notes that among themselves, they might discuss things quite differently. Intuition, energy, maybe learning techniques from lay practitioners. It shows there are plural TCMs, different versions presented depending on the audience and the context.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift to India. The source talks about incredibly high therapeutic pluralism there.
Yes, it's a prime example. Depending on where you are, patients can choose from multiple, long-standing, often state-recognized modalities. Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, Sowa Rigpa, plus homeopathy, and of course, biomedicine.
And here, the idea of statist medicine is broader.
That's right. In India, statist medicine can actually encompass systems like Ayurveda, Unani, and Siddha because these traditional systems have become entangled with the state apparatus getting state funding, having state-regulated colleges in a way they haven't in most Western countries.
Colonialism must have played a big role in shaping how these systems relate to each other.
Absolutely. A huge impact. But again, it's not a simple story of outright rejection of Western ideas by traditional systems.
Oh.
The source points out that major traditions like Ayurveda weren't necessarily opposed to absorbing concepts like germ theory, for instance, but they might integrate it differently.
How so?
They might emphasize that the soil, the person's overall constitution and condition, is just as important, if not more so, than the seed, the germ itself. It's a different emphasis.
I see. What about post-independence efforts?
There were moves to try and rationalize systems like Ayurveda and Unani, sometimes based on this idea that science is universal. The Chopra report even tried to claim Ayurveda as the remote source of both Western and Arabian medicine, sort of boosting its scientific credentials.
Trying to fit it into a global scientific narrative.
Exactly. But challenges exist within the institutions today. Ayurvedic students might learn classical theory, but then default to using standard biomedical disease categories when they're working in clinical wards.
A disconnect between theory and practice.
Somewhat. And many lack the deep Sanskrit knowledge needed to fully engage with the ancient texts. Research often struggles, too, trying to fit traditional remedies into biomedical research models, like isolating single active components.
Which faces resistance.
Yes, from practitioners who feel the holistic effect of the whole herb or formula is crucial and can't be reduced like that.
And beyond the formal institutions and the state, what's happening on the ground?
There's a huge, vibrant layer of everyday practice. People naturally use common household items like turmeric or cumin as folk medicine, learned within families, passed down through generations. You have practitioners like bone setters who operate largely outside the formal sector, often unpaid or working for gifts, relying on local knowledge and community trust.
The source calls these subaltern practices, right? The ones operating outside the main state-controlled system.
Exactly. They are found globally
Yeah.
and can be incredibly syncretic, blending different traditions. Think about practices that combine religion and healing, like voodoo or espiritismo, using herbs, charms, prayers, but maybe also incorporating modern elements like vitamins or even getting black market antibiotics from a border pharmacy if needed. They are dynamic, constantly adapting and evolving.
So pulling this thread together, it seems while Western systems often try to assimilate other practices by sort of reframing them in biomedical terms.
Right, fitting them into their box.
In places like China and India, there's a more deeply embedded, though often managed or orchestrated, pluralism. Traditional systems have a much more complex, evolving relationship with both the state and biomedicine there.
It's a different dynamic, absolutely. And underpinning all of this, the history, the regulation, the individual choices, is that fundamental question. What counts as legitimate knowledge? What's valid evidence when it comes to healing?
Yeah, the evidence question is huge. Biomedicine really cemented its authority by claiming its interventions were scientifically proven, didn't it? Especially with the rise of evidence-based medicine in the 90s.
Definitely. Influenced by figures like Archie Cochrane,
Yeah.
and the randomized controlled trial, the RCT, became the undisputed gold standard for evidence.
Right, the RCT. Comparing a treatment to a placebo, ideally double-blind.
To control for that tricky placebo effect, which the source notes can influence outcomes quite significantly, maybe up to 40% depending on the condition.
And RCTs were initially developed and became central for testing pharmaceuticals, right?
That's their origin. The first famous one was for the antibiotic streptomycin back in 1946, and then the thalidomide tragedy in the 60s really pushed for rigorous RCT testing before drugs could be marketed.
But here's the challenge the source highlights. Are RCTs always the right tool for every therapeutic approach?
That's the key question. The source argues they're often difficult, or maybe just plain inappropriate, for many therapies, both within and outside conventional medicine.
Like what?
Well, think about skill-based therapies, psychotherapy, massage, body work, even acupuncture. The practitioner knows if they're giving the real treatment or a sham version.
Ah, so you can't truly blind the practitioner.
Exactly, and that knowledge can subtly influence how they interact with the patient and potentially the outcome itself. It complicates the blinding.
Okay, what else?
Individualized approaches like classical homeopathy. The whole point there is that the prescribing is tailored to the unique person, not just the disease label.
Right.
So two people with the same diagnosis might get completely different remedies. Trying to run a standard trial comparing one specific remedy to a placebo for everyone with that diagnosis, it kind of misses the point of the therapy itself.
It doesn't fit the
It
model.
really doesn't. And then there's the cost factor. RCTs are hugely expensive.
Millions, often.
Right. Therapies based on non-patented substances, whether that's traditional herbs, specific diets, or supplements, often lack the corporate funding needed to run those massive trials.
So they struggle to generate that gold standard evidence, even if they might be effective.
Makes it much harder, yeah,
Mm.
regardless of their potential benefits.
And evidence-based medicine, while aiming for better standards, has had other impacts.
Yes, it's led to clinical guidelines
Yeah.
aimed at standardizing practice, reducing variation, informing cost-effectiveness calculations for health systems.
Which can be good.
Can be,
Yeah.
but the source argues it can also inadvertently limit clinical autonomy, the doctor's ability to tailor treatment and narrow the range of therapeutic options considered valid for patients. And it reinforces the biomedical paradigm by essentially demanding that other systems seeking state legitimacy or funding prove themselves using methods designed for pharmaceuticals. It requires them to fit into biomedicine's evidentiary box.
But away from the clinical trials, the guidelines, the state regulations,
Well,
where is therapeutic pluralism perhaps most vibrant and undeniable?
in people's homes. The source really shifts focus here to the individual, the user. They become a kind of active integrator, engaging in what the source calls hybrid therapeutics.
Hybrid therapeutics. Tell me more.
People are pragmatic, they mix and match, they try out different approaches, they're constantly taking advice from family, friends, colleagues, maybe a GP, maybe a naturopath, maybe Dr.
A
Google.
whole mix of sources.
Exactly. They're actively forging their own healing paths based on what feels right to them, what aligns with their values, and crucially, what seems to be working for them. This is especially true for chronic conditions, where there often isn't one single magic bullet from any system.
Can you give some examples from the source?
Oh, fantastic examples. Someone mixing antibiotics prescribed by their doctor with probiotics and high-dose vitamin C they read about. Someone rejecting an osteopath's diagnosis after doing their own symptom search online.
Taking control.
Yeah. Choosing a naturopath's appetite stimulant over a doctor's recommendation for an enema. People become experts in their own household remedies using homeopathy kits, essential oils.
Right.
One person in the research even said, quite casually, "We even treat the dog with homeopathy." It shows how embedded it can become. It's about experimentation, finding the right dose of vitamin C by monitoring bowel effects, adjusting homeopathic drops, lots of trial and error across different CAMs.
And where does the advice come from? Who do people trust?
It varies hugely. People have different trust hierarchies. For some, a chiropractor might be at the top for certain issues. Others rely more on practicality and common sense, maybe trusting a pharmacist's advice for heartburn over a doctor's or a nutritionist's. Friends and family with what the source calls health cultural capital. People in your circle who seem knowledgeable about health practices.
Yeah.
They're crucial. The internet, obviously.
And passing things down.
Definitely. That intergenerational transfer of knowledge. Getting a specific zinc formula recommendation from a brother, or using ibuprofen or a particular teething gel because your mom always did and said it worked.
This all plays out, often quite subtly, even in the encounter between a patient and their GP, right? It can be a delicate dance.
Very delicate. Patients might hide their CAM use, or the fact they aren't taking their prescriptions, maybe to avoid judgment or a lecture.
Yeah, I can see that.
And GPs often respond carefully. They want to assert the biomedical view, the standard advice, but often without alienating the patient or challenging their choices too forcefully, especially if the patient seems committed.
How do you manage that?
They might say something cautious, like, well, it may well be that it works perfectly well for you, but then express concern about potential interactions with prescribed meds or lack of robust evidence. It's about asserting the dominant paradigm, but, as the source puts it, leaving room around the edges for some limited famp.
Gently steering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's that specific example of the patient asking about a blood type diet.
Oh, yeah.
But as soon as the GP dismisses it quite strongly, calling such diets bunkum and promoting the standard Mediterranean diet, the patient immediately backs down and agrees.
Ah. Shows how aware patients are of what's considered legitimate or illegitimate knowledge in that specific GP setting.
Precisely. They read the room. The source even gives an exceptional example of a GP who is also a trained naturopath.
Oh, wow. How does that work?
Well, even for them, offering alternative approaches requires significant interactional work, as the source calls it. Carefully checking if the patient is actually open to hearing about it, providing long explanations like the theory behind a Paleolithic diet, and sometimes even directly contradicting official Ministry of Health advice, calling that bunkum in that specific patient context. It takes a lot more effort.
So it's not straightforward even then.
Not at all. The source touches on sociological concepts like habitus, how our social background shapes our perceptions and choices without us realizing it. But it stresses that in the home, CAM use is often highly contingent, dynamic, a kaleidoscopic spectacle of options and decisions rather than some fixed, predetermined practice. It really is hybrid therapeutics in action.
And when the stakes are at their absolute highest, these dynamics, these tensions, they become even more intense, right? Nowhere clearer than in cancer care.
Absolutely. The source discusses the very high rates of CAM use among cancer patients. Estimates vary wildly, maybe 33% up to 90%, depending on how you define CAM and the study population.
So why so high in cancer?
Well, there's the immense fear and dread associated with the diagnosis itself, and also with the aggressive, often difficult conventional treatments, chemo, radiotherapy, surgery.
Yeah.
For those facing a poor prognosis, CAM might be used almost out of desperation. On the off chance it might help, where conventional medicine seems to be failing.
Does the source mention positive aspects?
It does. It notes that CAM use can provide crucial psychological benefits, a sense of empowerment, regaining some control, fostering hope in a terrifying situation.
Oh.
And some research, though often debated, suggests practices like meditation, mindfulness, mental imagery, when combined with conventional care, might even be associated with longer survival times in some cases.
What about attributing survival if someone does well?
That's fascinating. Research looking at exceptional survivors, people who live much longer than expected, found something interesting. Biomedical doctors tended to attribute survival to their treatments. Alternative practitioners attributed to their interventions. And the patients themselves. Often, especially those who used both, attributed their survival to combinations, the chemo plus the supplements, plus their own dietary changes and positive attitude. They saw it as a team effort, with themselves as a key player.
Taking agency. But high stakes can also intensify clashes, right, between patients and doctors.
Definitely. The source gives a really powerful, specific example of a Maori patient with cancer in New Zealand. She wanted to use traditional Rongo herbal treatment.
Okay.
She felt the oncologist completely dismissed her choice. Pooh-poohed it, as she said, and implicitly suggested she'd be a dead person if she chose that path over conventional treatment.
Wow, that's blunt.
Yeah, and her response was equally strong. She pointed out that many Pākehā patients, non-Maori New Zealanders, also die under conventional treatment, under the knife. It shows a complete breakdown of the relationship, a clash of knowledge systems, fueled by perceived disrespect at an incredibly vulnerable time.
That's heartbreaking.
It really highlights the intensity. Another case study the source uses to explore this tension between status medicine and those subaltern, sometimes underground practices is medicinal cannabis.
Ah, cannabis. That's a hot topic.
And it has this really ambiguous status, doesn't it? Seen by some as a legitimate healing agent, but often legally classified as an illegal recreational drug carrying stigma.
Right.
Now, synthesized forms of cannabis, or specific cannabinoids like CBD, can sometimes be prescribed by doctors. That pulls it into the status medicine system under medical control.
Okay, the official route.
But the subaltern forms, often the whole plant, used in ways outside medical protocols, operate underground. They evade state control and the medical profession, and are sometimes linked, fairly or unfairly, to the criminal world.
The source mentions green fairies.
Yes, in New Zealand, people who supply cannabis, often oils or edibles specifically for medical use, trying hard to distance themselves from the drug dealer label. They see themselves as caregivers.
And there was the Helen Kelly case?
A very prominent example. Helen Kelly was a high-profile union leader in New Zealand. She illegally accessed cannabis for pain relief during her own cancer treatment with chemotherapy.
Right.
She then became a powerful public advocate for legalization and easier patient access, lobbying the state after her own application for legal access failed. She supported patient advocacy groups like MCNZ. It shows how even prominent citizens sometimes have to access these subaltern forms and then fight to change the system from the outside.
And how does status medicine typically respond to this kind of pressure?
The typical response, the source argues, is to reassert control. Demand evidence via RCTs, often rejecting whole herb approaches in favor of isolated patentable components, and reinforcing biomedical authority through state agencies like the Ministry of Health or the FDA.
So even if cannabis gets incorporated, it's often stripped of its subaltern context. Exactly. The control shifts back to medical elites and pharmaceutical models. Legalization could change the landscape, potentially allowing CAM practitioners a more public role, but the source suggests status medicine would likely still try hard to control the specific health claims made about it.
This whole picture, it really raises a critical question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Who actually gets to decide what counts as legitimate healing, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high? like in cancer.
Yeah.
And how do history, legal status, the power struggles between professions,
Yeah.
how do all these factors profoundly shape the actual options available to people who are just seeking help?
It's incredibly complex.
So we've journeyed through this really intricate landscape. We've looked at the historical battles, the clash of systems, the political and economic forces, those power dynamics between professions and the state, the surprising history of practices we now label orthodox or alternative, and the really dynamic, creative ways individuals navigate this whole world in their own lives. And a key theme that emerges, the source repeatedly emphasizes, is that when efforts are made to integrate CAM into the mainstream, it often ends up looking more like assimilation, taking certain aspects of CAM, maybe the ones that are easiest to study or seem least threatening, reshaping them, framing them in biomedical language.
It's fitting them in.
Right. Largely as a way for the dominant system to manage and control these popular practices, rather than truly embracing fundamentally different therapeutic possibilities. The underlying logic, the source suggests, is often quite pragmatic for biomedicine. Better to have popular CAM approaches inside biomedicine rather than outside pulling patients away. Keep them in the tent.
Control, again, and we see tensions not just between systems, but even within them, right?
Absolutely. GPs who use CAM might face skepticism from their more conventional colleagues. Medical acupuncturists might present different faces to different audiences, as we discussed. There are internal debates and power struggles within chiropractic itself about its scope and philosophy. It's not monolithic on either side.
And it's clear that state support for non-biomedical systems is possible. We saw that in China and India.
Yes, it can happen. But that support often comes with strings attached. Demands for standardization, for reshaping practices through the state's lens or the biomedical lens. And the reasons for that support might have less to do with pure scientific evidence and more to do with changing political ideologies, national needs, economics, or even nationalism.
And meanwhile, away from the state and the formal professions, those vibrant, diverse, syncretic folk and subaltern practices, they just continue, don't they?
They thrive globally, often unregulated, deeply embedded in communities and households, constantly evolving and adapting in response to social change and people's needs. They're incredibly resilient.
Now, there's a fascinating concept from the source that kind of ties all this together, especially the debates around evidence. The experimenter's regress.
Ah, yes, from Collins and Pinch. It's a really insightful idea from the sociology of science.
Explain that a bit. What is the experimenter's regress?
It suggests that in scientific fields where there's ongoing controversy, where there isn't already a clear, settled consensus, simply doing more experiments doesn't automatically reveal the objective truth and settle the debate.
Why not? Don't experiments give us answers?
Well, the regress comes in because whether a particular experiment is judged as being a good experiment, a competent one that produced a real result, often depends on whether its findings align with the existing beliefs or the emerging consensus within that scientific community.
So if it confirms what people already think, it's a good experiment.
Essentially, yes. Experiments supporting the consensus are seen as well-designed, confidently executed. Those that contradict the consensus are often dismissed. The experiment must have been flawed, the equipment faulty, or the researchers just weren't skilled enough. You need to know what the right answer is to know if the experiment worked, but the experiment is supposed to tell you the right answer. That's the regress.
Wow. Okay, how does that apply to the CAM and biomedicine debate?
Well, the source suggests that the eventual acceptance, even partial acceptance, of practices like chiropractic or acupuncture wasn't just about some definitive scientific proof suddenly emerging that convinced everyone. It also involved a long social and political struggle, breaking their association with perceived quackery or irrationalism, finding ways to present themselves that fit better with scientific norms, achieving what the source calls a precarious balancing act that allowed them to be perceived as more legitimate by the dominant group.
So the consensus about what counts as valid therapeutic knowledge isn't just shaped by raw empirical data.
No, it's deeply shaped by social factors, historical context, professional interests, power dynamics, not only by the experiments themselves.
This understanding is really powerful. So let me pose this to you and to our listeners. Given that the validation of therapeutic knowledge, even within science itself, can be tied to achieving this kind of social consensus shaped by all these complex factors, How should you, as a learner, as someone potentially using healthcare, navigate the multiple therapeutic phases of healing that are available today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've traced these historical battles, the clashes of systems, the political and economic forces swirling around, the power dynamics between professions and the state,
Mm-hmm.
and the surprising evolution of practices we now label orthodox or alternative, and the incredibly creative, sometimes confusing ways individuals piece together their own healing paths from everything on offer.
And the big takeaway, I think, is that the world of healing isn't some simple hierarchy based purely on objective scientific truth handed down from on high.
No, it's far messier and more interesting than that. It's a complex, dynamic interplay of history, power, culture, regulation, money, and individual experience and belief. Therapeutic pluralism, whether it's officially sanctioned by the state or thriving subalternally in people's homes and communities, is the lived reality for most people around the world.
Understanding this history, understanding these powerful dynamics, it doesn't necessarily give you simple answers about which therapy is best,
No, it doesn't.
but it does help you critically evaluate the health information you encounter, the choices you make. It highlights that your own experiences, your own decisions in seeking healing are part of this larger, ongoing, fascinating story.
Hmm.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing directly from these ideas in the source. If the acceptance of therapies, even scientifically validated ones to some extent, isn't solely based on some undeniable universal experimental proof, but relies significantly on achieving a kind of social consensus about what counts as truth in healing, what does that tell us about the healing systems we trust today? And perhaps more importantly, how might that consensus continue to shift in the future?
Something to ponder. Keep diving deep.